Thanks everybody for joining us today. My name is Heather Buchanan. I'm co-founder of an initiative called Bankers for Net Zero. We're the UK country chapter of the Net Zero Banking Alliance, and we really look at the commitments that banks have made under that alliance and how we best implement those within the kind of regulatory and legislative environment in the UK. So I'm really, really pleased to be here today. We've got, I'll just maybe do a quick round of introductions with our panelists. Welcoming Bob Wigley, who's Chair of UK Finance. We've got Nina Siga, Director of CISL, and Nazo Musa, the Managing Partner of Energy Impact Partners Europe, and Seb Henbest, who's Group Head of Climate Transition at HSBC. I'm just going to go around the room kind of first, and please do kind of introduce yourselves more if you'd like. So first, Bob, you've had a long career history in working across financial services. How have the attitudes towards net zero and sustainable investment and finance changed over the recent years?
I mean, in short, massively, but let me take you through it. So I think many firms have played a leading role in supporting sustainability outcomes for decades, with some of our own smaller and larger members, Ecology Building Society and Triodos Bank, acting as real frontrunners, and then the likes of HSBC establishing their Climate Change Centre of Excellence as early as 2007. But the banking sector's activities have really picked up, I think, over the last 10 years, quite dramatically, particularly with the recognition of the financial stability implications of climate change by central banks since around 2017. COP26 obviously was a real catalyst for that evolution around the world, but especially for the UK, which played a key role in putting finance at the heart of the transition agenda at home and on the world stage. COP26 was very much, I think, the defining moment for our sector, and clearly the pace of change has only accelerated since then. I don't think there's any doubt that the scale of urgency is now firmly embedded in our sector, as you know better than anybody. Since we welcomed COP to Glasgow, a lot of initiatives in the financial sector have continued to make a big difference in how we think about financing the transition and how we integrate it into our planning processes. You've got the examples of groups like GFANZ, the Net Zero Banking Association, who are really leading the charge on net zero and on the reflections around the transition from a business perspective. Recently, it's been very good to see the work of the net zero transition plans become central to the strategies of many of our members. The brilliant work done by the Transition Plan Task Force, with a strong emphasis on public-private partnership, has delivered state-of-the-art standard to help guide banks through an orderly transition with their own books, and should help, I think, guide the rest of the economy too. But it's been good to see the debate go beyond net zero. I see real encouragement in the discourse around nature, around biodiversity, for the financial sector to step up to those challenges too, and think about the transition in a more holistic way. We've come a long way in a remarkably short period of time, but we recognise this is an uphill climb. McKinsey have estimated the average spending on physical assets will need to increase by about 3.5 trillion per year up to 2050 in order to achieve net zero. Our sector understands the role we have to play in that. We see, I think, meaningful efforts from many of our members trying to increase their contribution to transition, a wide variety of solutions, public-private partnerships, blended finance solutions to help unlock more capital for green industry, a variety of concessionary products that seek to incentivize green action by clients, and the deployment of greater advisory services to finance large infrastructure projects like renewable power generation. So, all I would say by way of closing is I just have to caution you, banks can do so much, but they can't do everything. We do need other members of the real economy to step up in terms of their activities around their sector-specific plans, data, telling us what they need so that we can plan our own businesses. And ultimately, we need absolute clarity around government policy. I'll leave it, I think, with that final point.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Bob. And I absolutely agree, particularly all the work that we've got going on transition plans. Those are going to be absolutely critical in terms of making sure that we get a smooth transition and be able to finance things as we go. So Nazo Musad, in your work across Europe, How engaged are the European markets in supporting net zero investment? And from your perspective, is the UK lagging behind?
Well, I think there's a little bit of a mixed picture. When you take a look at the near-term financing needs, last year was a record year, 1.1 trillion invested behind climate, 30% increase. The first time climate investments match fossil fuel investments. These are all BNEF figures. So, all of that looks quite rosy. But behind that, we first of all have to take a look that, again, according to BNEF, those numbers need to triple by 2030. So there's quite a bit more to do. And of course, these numbers don't sort of go smoothly upwards to the right. When we looked at the tail end of 2022, those numbers started to come off. These are cyclical markets. And I think the numbers for Q1 were 40% off relative to the previous year. So we've got a lot more work there to do. And then maybe the final part is most of that capital, the 1.1 trillion that's been invested, is really behind known technologies, what I call in the ground technologies, established business models. So this is solar, this is wind, and even there we're having some challenges, right, on the economics of it. But once we go, that's going to get us to 2030. But once we go beyond 2030, that's where you need to tackle the really hard to abate industries. And there, I think things get a lot more challenging, where the typical market mechanisms don't really work today. We managed to raise a fund called Frontier that tackles exactly those types of problems. And the way we managed to do it, because the financial models there are not known, is to bring the industry behind us. So we have one of the largest energy coalition, 60 plus companies that back us and provide some of the forward visibility on pricing, on demand, in addition to capital. So it's those types of financing models that are required. In response to your question about the UK, I think, the UK is a great center of innovation. It's been my home for the last 20 years. If you look at the venture capital funding here, it's extraordinary. I think the challenge, and even when it comes to climate, larger than Germany, France combined, I think the challenge is, when you look at the top 10 investments in the last year, one came from the UK, and it was less than 1/10 the investment of any of the top three that went into Northvolt, Climeworks, etc. And I think in some of the key areas where we need the investment behind electrification, behind batteries, this is where we're starting to fall behind. So.
Excellent. Thank you very much. So I'm going to give you one of my favorite facts is our modern accounting system really had its origins in Italy in the 15th century. So we've had just over 500 years to get our reporting just right. And now in a matter of decades, we're really having to redefine risk and return. So my question, of course, to Dr. Sega is where we are fundamentally redefining what risk looks like and what value is. How do we empower FIs, who of course, we've got institutions such as HSBC here, and institutions that have been around for literally hundreds of years and have this kind of traditional sense of value and risk embedded into every part of the institution. So how do we empower them to make this transition?
It's a really good comparison. I'll make you a slightly different one. During the COVID crisis, we've also managed to completely move into the digital world in the space of about a couple of weeks. So let's not assume it's going to take us another 500 years to get to a proper environmental risk profile. Let's aim for something slightly shorter. I think if you look at what has been happening in the space of environmental source of risk and how they translate into mainstream financial risk frameworks, We now have the methodologies to understand that. We know that there are physical sources of risks that are already sitting on the balance sheet of our banks, of our investment managers, of our asset owners, and of our insurance companies. I think the interesting perspective here is that sometimes we look at these things in a very strict sectoral borders. So we think physical sources of risk, let's think about flooding, let's think about higher heat. That's an insurance problem. However, the insurance industry has a 12 months time horizon, which effectively means they will take the hit in the first year, and the next year they'll either put the premiums up or they move out of the market, which means it's a banking problem if you're sitting on a book of mortgages that have that kind of risk. It's an asset owner problem if you're a homeowner. So effectively, I think we have seen huge strides across the entire financial system in bringing environmental source of risk. And, thanks, Bob, for mentioning nature also in that. So, yes, we've seen work on climate risks and how do they fit into investment portfolios, how do they fit into banking portfolios. We're starting to think through the financial materiality of nature in those portfolios, and we already have really good examples and use cases, some of which we've developed at CISL, looking at, for example, how water stress would hit a portfolio of heavy industry clients. Actually, that's something we've done with HSBC together, and how actually the credit ratings of that portfolio will go down in a particular very realistic water stress scenario. So we've seen that work. Having said that, we haven't yet gotten to a systemic picture of how our financial system as a whole is exposed. And that's where a lot of the financial regulators are thinking about it. The other area, which I think we need to get to quite a bit more progress on, is our impact. So thinking through the opportunities, very much in the area of what Nazir was talking about it. We're very good in renewables, hard to abate sectors, hard decarbonization, farming portfolios, all of those things. There are methodologies there, but it needs a little bit more action. And of course, the academic institutions, the multitude of pre-competitive collaborations that are happening across the market are helping to move those conversations much further down the line.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And Seb, from a bank's perspective, how are you kind of supporting your clients to maximize their own investments and make their transitions?
Yeah, well, I think we had a 1.1 trillion record last year, doubling or tripling this decade to get on track. There's a million estimates, but it's 100 to 200 trillion to 2050. You don't get to net zero without mobilizing a heap of capital. And I guess our role as a bank is to help drive the capital to those companies, those projects, those technologies that are the pathway to net zero, and be able to identify those and actually organize the institution to be able to deliver that. And it's critical that we can get on track this decade. I think many in the audience will be aware, but the carbon budget for 1.5 degrees is horribly tight. The difference in carbon budget between 1.5 and 2 degrees is a factor of 3. So if we're serious about 1.5 degree net zero, not just 2 degree net zero or more, we've got to do a lot this decade. And we've committed already 750 billion to $1 trillion towards this effort between now and 2030. And we're just one bank. So the whole industry is starting to move in that direction. So that's the promising news. I think the how do we get the capital to our clients who are pushing the net zero agenda and are going to be successful, it comes down to a couple of things. One, it's a bit of a mindset shift. We've got to think about this as a bank in terms of the opportunity that it presents. This is not just a risk to be managed. This is an opportunity to be grasped. We find a whole bunch of bankers, they're essentially salespeople, really like to sell opportunity. That's what motivates them. They're not motivated by regulation. They're not motivated by risk. These are barriers and constraints. We want to get the capital flow. We have to set it up as an opportunity and to think of it as core business. I think for a long time, ESG has been this bundle of warm, fuzzy good things that sit adjunct to core business. And our mission here is to make it core business. which means every time we're talking to a client, this is front and center. And it's one of our 4 global strategic pillars is to become a net zero bank. So becoming core business makes a lot of sense if we're thinking that this is an industrial revolution. This is about rebuilding the world economy around zero emissions. And HSBC's been around for 150 years, building the world economy. It's a bricks and mortar type financial institution that fits very well with our mission. And I think internally we're very comfortable with aligning ourselves to that. In practice, we've got to build the capacity in the bank. Part of that's having the knowledge and understanding through the institution about what transition actually means, what are the pathways, how do we do it, and we're bringing that expertise in actually. So the Chief Sustainability Officer at HSBC has a PhD in climate science. My job as head of climate transition, I was previously chief economist at Bloomberg NEF, where we got some figures from. BNF will be pleased they're being quoted. Running the New Energy Outlook, all the scenarios. And around me in the division that's driving this in HSBC is technical experts around technology, sector transition experts, climate analytics people, data people, to build the ecosystem of capability that we can then go and help support the frontline bankers to go and bank the transition and find those opportunities. We also have to do another thing, which is to align the stewards of capital in the bank. Because the bankers can't just go and bank anything. They're constrained by their risk colleagues. They're constrained by the finance department that says how much capital is available for what types of things. So we really need to work internally as well as externally on making that capital available to get comfortable with newer technologies, projects that we haven't done a lot before, to make more of the balance sheet available for that. Even early stage technologies, and we're a lender, you know, we're not venture capital here, but we're doing more of that, venture debt, private equity within the bank, recognizing that heap of the technology that we need, we don't yet have. And then around all that is a set of targets and guide rails, because if we can set ourselves targets that bind and bite and are public, then it means the portfolio has to shift. The worst case scenario is us to pull out capital, because that doesn't do anything to emissions. The best case scenario of us to use the relationships we've got, leverage those to influence our clients, try and accelerate what they're doing, support it when they're doing things that are climate aligned, and kick the tires and challenge when they're not. And we've now set targets for oil and gas, power and utilities, cement, aviation, what else? Autos, the list will go on. There's more coming next year on agriculture and buildings, and this is a huge challenge for the bank to do. And we might talk about that a little bit later. But with those targets, coupled with policies on coal-fired power and coal mining, policies on energy and what we have now of appetite for, that creates a landscape that increasingly directs all that capital towards the net zero transition. And we only then get there by talking to our clients, working with them on it, and supporting them on their journey, knowing that not everyone's going to take that plan, not everyone's going to go on that journey with us, but that's our starting point.
Excellent, thank you very much. And so important, particularly as you know, climate, our objectives. It is a kind of zero-sum game, isn't it? So that stewardship element is so important in terms of businesses, because otherwise, the last thing we want are things getting pushed out of this kind of I'd say almost nurturing environment we're trying to create here. So Bob, COVID-19 showed us that we can move quickly and at pace when we need to. As we said, move to the digital age at speed. So how's the financial sector engaging proactively with policymakers to really kind of get the rails in place so that it can really play its role?
Great question. So within my organisation, I would say there is no higher priority than the work stream that's focused on transitioning to net zero. It's as simple as that. It's increasingly embedded in all our engagement with government, with parliamentarians and other stakeholders. Now, as you well know, the government recently made some major announcements on green finance. Obviously, we were involved in helping to craft some of those around energy efficiency and in particular how we power up Britain. So we're collaborating with government on a day-to-day basis on what is necessary or indeed isn't necessary from a financial regulation perspective. And I would say that I think we're at this stage fairly confident that with what is in the pipeline, which we already have some visibility of, including the upcoming consultations on a green taxonomy, that we are, very much heading in the right direction, especially if we keep this daily dialogue and collaboration, including with, organisations like your own, going. I think where the sector is rightly proactive and can make a real impact is in helping the wider real economy and public sector think about the overall transition, not just for our sector, but for the wider economy at large, where, of course, all our clients operate. Our members have given us the mandate to support them in accelerating the pace of change in our industry, but across the whole economy. And I do think we have a bit of a concern over the degree of responsibility that's thrust upon us relative perhaps to what's put on wider industry. So our balance sheets reflect very much that wider economy. That's where we're lending money. And in the end, if we're not working hand in glove with our clients in the private sector and working at the same pace, we're not going to make the progress we need to. So that's why we have this absolute laser-like focus on the sector-specific transition plans. And we've seen some recently. They've been quite good, but I would say they don't go far enough. They don't set out in detail, in my view, enough the scale of investment required by some of these sectors. They don't put a figure on it very often. And they don't often identify the barriers to that investment and map out timelines. So it's about getting, I think, a bit more granular, a bit more specific, more numbers. Of course, this is a nascent process. It's iterative. We're expecting it to develop over time, but I think we just got to push on that detail. So specific areas where we can offer the experience of the sector as a whole, perhaps where others are less placed to do so. I think I'll work on net zero homes. I hope that all of you have seen the report we put out recently, looking at forward, clear, practical recommendations to government on how we can tackle the issue of our 20 million homes in the UK that need greening over the next 10 years. So we're very actively engaged on this. It's probably the one area where banks can be most immediately engaged and have the biggest impact. So we're involved in the Energy Efficiency Task Force, where my CEO, David Posting, is heavily involved. And we look forward to trying to drive what's necessary to really have an impact on greening the UK housing stock.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And absolutely critical that the housing stock, I know, is one of our biggest challenges, and getting the funding out there. I certainly know I've got a house that needs retrofitting and waiting for things to come along. So, and Dr. Siga, so CISL has long advocated for bringing together government and finance groups to identify solutions and advocate for change. So where are you seeing the public sector actors playing a larger role in transforming the financial system to net zero?
Yeah, so it's quite interesting. And you were just talking about the housing stock. We're about to publish a report with our insurance platform, ClimateWise, in June around housing and flooding, and how the planning bodies, as well as local authorities, as well as the insurance industry, can work together to ensure we have much more resilient homes. But if I step back from that one and talk about where we have really seen the financial regulatory scope driving some of this work, it's if you look at the work the Bank of England has been doing, particularly in stress testing, a lot of that is less about the numbers that comes out of particular stress tests, but more about the process. It's about building the capacity within financial institutions to actually be able to look through their portfolios and know what they've got in them. But it is absolutely key to have policy, finance, and corporates in the same room, kind of reflective on what Bob was saying effectively, because then you can have a much more fundamental discussion around where the industry is going, where more capital is needed within that industry, and where the policy and regulation can support it. Recently, we've done some really interesting work with our investment leaders group on decent work. So how do we know which investment funds, how our investment portfolios are actually not only driving the net zero transition, but driving a just transition, looking at what kinds of jobs they're creating. And then we had a workshop on it in Brussels with the European Commission, with our corporate leaders group, which has been driving a lot of the policy engagement in these issues, bringing investment managers, bringing corporates, bringing the European Commission into the room to think about the kinds of regulations that we need to support this process, but also to understand how the financial industry can engage with corporates in a better way. What are we going to be expecting of them? What are we going to be asking of them? So it is very much key to have that round conversation taking place.
Absolutely. I'm going to move on to data, and I would have kind of moderator's privilege a bit here, because this is a subject very close to my heart, certainly. I mean, Seb, when we speak to our members, everybody's talking about that having gaps in reliable data. And so what are you doing in terms of bridging these data gaps? How are you supporting clients? I mean, again, back to our kind of P&L discussion, I think particularly at the smaller kind of SME level, there's not even an agreed methodology for how we kind of report all of this. So how are you working through these challenges? Because obviously that's the kind of core information you need to make investment decisions.
Yeah, I mean, the challenge is really big because if you think about, especially a bank like HSBC, we're in every sector of the economy. So even to determine our scope 1, 2, 3 exposure is a real challenge. That breadth is part of the superpower of the organization, but also, one of the big hills it's got to climb. Most financial institutions are suffering from some degree of data inadequacy. And really, this is generally because, in very simple terms, no one's collected this stuff. It doesn't exist. So we have to construct it using proxies themselves, which may not exist, and we go down and down sort of the ladder of data quality to the point where maybe this is even worth disclosing or talking about because it's so weak. And if you think about the data challenge, it's not just about the data in the industry, it's also about us organizing our own data. For 150 years, we haven't collected certain data because we never knew we would need it, and now we need it, and we've got to reverse engineer it. So, for example, we didn't collect in our real estate portfolio the square meterage of each investment within that portfolio, each part of that portfolio. And now we need it. Now, in some parts of the world, that's really well disclosed, and we can get it. In the UK, it's really good. But in Hong Kong, it's the Hong Kong Shanghai Banking Corporation, after all. We have a big real estate portfolio. There ain't nothing. So what do we do? Well, this is a bit of a journey in the industry to try and improve external data. Everyone's trying to improve their own internal data so we can meld them together and create the emissions and financed emissions proxies we need to set our baselines and targets and monitor our trajectory on this journey to net zero. There's a lot of initiatives going on to try and do this at a systemic level rather than each bank going out and trying to solve their own individual problems, which is a good thing. There's a lot of repetition and a lot of inefficiencies. Mentioned GFANZ before, the Glasgow Financial Alliance and Net Zero is building a public data utility with Bloomberg actually at the moment, which we're involved in. PCAF, which is the sort of carbon accounting standards for the financial industry, is trying to develop a database of emissions factors that can be used across every sector. We've got our group public affairs people talking to regulators and legislators to try and get more disclosed. Because the fundamental gap is that not all companies disclose. Certainly not all public companies. And if you've got a whole set of private companies in your book with very little obligation to do that, you've got even bigger gaps in your data. When we talk to our clients, though, and the final point on this is, we're talking to them about their transition plans. One of the things we ask about is their disclosures. So our expectations of them increasingly is, are you telling us about your scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 emissions? Are you doing it in a level of detail that we can understand where the emissions challenge is in your business so we can understand how to support it? And I think as we go through this cycle over a number of iterations, we're going to find the pressure from the financial system revealing more data from the larger corporate space that we have to work with. And we're going to get to a point where this problem goes away. But for now, it's a hill we've all got to climb up.
Absolutely. And I'll probably just interject here a bit as well. I mean, that well, it sounded, just one line in a commitment for financial institutions to decarbonize their financed emissions by 2050. It's a very simple and kind of elegant statement, but the reality of actually having to understand that every single mortgage, every single overdraft, every single corporate loan you make, the supply chain of every corporate loan that you make is an extraordinary challenge. So certainly one of the things that we're doing, and HSBC and UK Finance have been involved in as well, amongst a whole plethora of acronyms that we don't go into, is how can we use the principles of open banking to start to get assurable asset level and entity level data to help support SMEs, and hopefully start to build from the bottom up some of that accurate data to help feed in thing. But that we are very much at the beginning of this, and as I say, it's an extraordinary challenge. I think people don't really realize that every person in the room that's got a mortgage, at some point there's going to be at the point where we need to understand that, and it's extraordinary. And just in terms of the actual investments, so Nazo, so how are investors using ESG data? Where are those gaps, and where would you like to see further kind of collaboration to fill those?
Yeah. Well, first of all, we as a fund need to have our own reporting. And when we began to think through how we might do that, we're an impact fund. So we have to look at our scope 1, 2, and 3, our portfolios, as well as the actual impact these companies are having. And the enormity of the problem sort of hit us a few years ago. And now the regulation, of course, is there as well. And I think, I'm a tech investor, so my first thought was, well, technology is going to come to the rescue. It's software. We're going to have these great analytics and so on. But at the heart, there is a data problem. And as you mentioned, we don't have the data. The data we have is in different pockets and different databases. It's in different formats. And most of small companies just don't have it, right? So the large corporates have more resources. And so one of the first things we did was we invested in such a data company called ESG Book that looks to provide this kind of more transparent, and a lot of the data we have, by the way, one of the challenges we have is you can't compare it because how one company measures it is entirely different from the way another company measures it. So it's kind of garbage in, garbage out. So having that sort of transparent data was really key to it. Now, we've got as a fund reporting requirements, our companies have it. One of, I think, the key things we have to be mindful of is how do you ensure that these smaller companies, a lot of them, they're small software companies, and yet they have the same reporting obligations as a larger manufacturer. And how do we make sure we don't sort of crush them as those regulatory frameworks come into the funds themselves? So I think that's a very key part of it. In terms of filling in the data gaps, I think where I'm hopeful is, first of all, we're seeing that the regulation itself is becoming more clear. If you think of SFDR, a year, 2 years ago when we were forming our fund, it just wasn't clear what an Article 9 fund was. So very hard to sign yourself up, even though today you may think you are an Article 9 fund. So I think some of that clarity coming through is super important. You mentioned a little bit the industry-wide initiatives. I think government sort of supporting those industry-wide initiatives is really key. And if you look at the metals industry, if you look at the chemical sector, this is where the sector has banded together themselves to bring more clarity. So I think that's quite key to it. And then, of course, the software and data is there to support us.
Absolutely. And so I guess I'm going to kind of do around in terms of if each one of you had one radical thing that was going to get things moving, what would it be? But if you kind of could pluck something out of a magic hat to get capital flowing, where do you think you'd go? And I'll go back to Bob on that one. Start with.
Well, I think there is an opportunity to think much more radically about a policy environment that addresses several societal challenges together, but including climate change in that process. One of the strengths of I'm afraid of that generation, I can't call it the IRA, but the US Inflation Reduction Act, is that it does link a vision for the future economy across multiple priorities, so including inflation, healthcare, climate change, and US industry. We, obviously, in this economy face many of the same issues. We've also got the rapid rise of artificial intelligence, which is only going to pose new challenges. And then we've got some sort of particularly UK long-held issues, uneven distribution of wealth and the sort of whole levelling up issue. So I do think we see an opportunity for a more holistic vision of what the economy could look like. We don't have, of course, the fiscal headroom that perhaps exists in some other jurisdictions, so that'll need careful thought. But I think examples of what we could do, or clearer expectations for home retrofit. So there are three big issues around the greening the housing stock. This is the one I want to come to, right? The first is the public don't understand what it's going to cost them. They don't realise that their house worth £130,000 is going to cost £25,000 to green, and it's only going to save them £500 to £700 a year in fuel saving. It's not economic. So step one, the government needs to be absolutely clear about how it's going to incentivise the public to do something which is essentially uneconomic. The second thing, we've talked about it, the amount of money that we need to do, it's about £500 billion in the UK alone to green the housing stock. So we need to think very creatively about how we finance the new type of mortgage that maybe needs to be attached to the property, not the individual, over a long enough time period that with those new incentives from government can make it economic so that we can actually lend against those homes. And then the third, and I think the biggest challenge, is this. I don't know anybody in this room who's tried to get a window repaired recently or a leaking tap repaired, but the idea that just supposing the government incentives were in position and the industry was standing ready with 500 billion to spend, that you could pick up the phone and call someone to come around and retrofit your home and do that to 20 million homes over the next 10 years is simply not a starter. So we need what I think is a green army, and I think to build the green army we need a green academy. If I was the government, I'd be thinking very, very radically about how I use the apprentice levy scheme. I'd be looking at youngsters and I'd say, let's create a green qualification, a green degree, go to the Green Academy, get a green degree, join the Green Army and retrofit UK housing. That would be my radical idea.
Fantastic. So I was actually at Parliament over the last couple of days speaking about this very issue with some delegates from the Dutch embassy. And one of the things that they were talking about, this is quite interesting in terms of the skill set you're talking about, for a lot of the qualifications, of course, that people have now, and if they work in oil and gas or they work on the platforms, there's obviously a lot of those skills are transferable. You're working at heights, you're working at heights in a rig or in a wind turbine, it's still the same thing. But interestingly, a lot of the actual qualifications are not transferable. And in order to transfer them, it actually costs the individual money to go and get that. And so there's some really simple things that we could also be doing within this to make this transition easy. And it's back to the holistic approach. I mean, absolutely agree with you there. And Seb, you, what's your radical transformation that we're going to make this all move?
Well, I think I'm going to disappoint with radical because I don't think it's very radical. I think it's a lot of what we need to do is just the basic economics of this better. And so forgive me for not having anything too radical, but at the end of the day, a huge amount of focus to date has been on the fossil fuel industry and reducing emissions from fossil fuels, reducing the use of fossil fuels, with not enough focus on the other side of the equation. So if you think about fossil fuels being energy supply, if you want to move away from those fossil fuels, you need the demand side of that to use different fuels, different energy sources. So electrification is one vector of change there. But if you're not focused enough on that demand side, the supply side ain't going to go down. We can ask all the oil and gas companies and coal companies to diversify, to look at new solutions, but they're still going to do core business because fundamentally there's a demand for the product and they've got shareholders who are looking for their dividends, and the whole system is not designed for them to capitulate their core business because it's the right climate thing to do, right? Yeah. That's not going to happen. If we want a reduction in emissions, we have to drive the demand side, which means that we have to start getting really serious sector by sector about what can you do to reduce demand for fossil fuels this decade and get on track for net zero. I mentioned before, you've got this 3 times multiple on 2 degrees and 1.5 degrees. If you map that forward from today, you start to run out of carbon budget, depending on who's doing the calculation, in 2027, 2028. Very, very tight. And right now, there is not the urgency to develop the demand side of that equation. And if we just focus on the supply side, we're going to create discontinuities, price shocks, and disorder, which is going to undermine the entire thing. So really, the radical idea here is that to meet the rate of change challenge, we have to mobilize the demand side of that energy equation. Right now, for the bank, when we go, certainly in Western markets, and a wind farm or a solar park is presented to the stewards of capital, they look at that and they go, the margins are too thin. Why would we put capital into that? And that's because there's too much capital chasing too few projects. Now, in other parts of the world, there may be not enough capital for complicated reasons, but there is a dearth of projects. The number of projects in the pipeline is not commensurate with the amount of decarbonisation that we need to get on track for net zero. So how do you mobilise that number of projects? Well, there's a set of things you've got to focus on this decade. And it's all the stuff you can deploy rapidly. So we can talk about hydrogen and carbon capture and synthetic fuels and all the things that we may need to get to zero. But right now, we've got to significantly increase the amount of wind and solar being built across the world. And it's economic today, and like 90% of world electricity supply. You go around the world, 90-odd% of places where electricity is made, it's cheaper to put a wind farm in or a solar park in than put a gas plant or a coal plant. And it's something like 65-ish%. It's cheaper to build the new renewables than run the old fossil fuel plants. So the economics are there. The rate of change is not there, which comes back really to policy. But you've got a set of renewable projects that pipeline just needs to accelerate. EVs are your other big vector of transformation this decade. We know those economics are increasingly crossing over. We can see the auto manufacturers mobilizing around emission standards and looking to try and position themselves to win that, to win that transition. For industry, you've really got low-hanging fruit in recycling, heat pumps for buildings. Buildings are terribly difficult. Totally agree. That's probably the hardest thing. But you've also got to think about mobilizing those supply chains. So we talked about the workforce, but if you think about an EV, it's facilitated by the battery supply chain, which is everything from mining, getting more capital into mining, to battery manufacturing, to auto manufacturing, to charging infrastructure. That whole ecosystem of things gives you more EVs. So without boiling the ocean here, if you're going to get a reduction in fossil fuel consumption this decade and get on track from an emissions perspective, we've got to mobilize the demand side, which means focusing on the policy that explicitly drives an increase in uptake. I don't know what that policy is. That's someone else's job. But if we don't do that, we're going to sail past 2 degrees with all the best intent in the world. And that's a simple, but I think actually the radical idea is we're just going to go way faster.
It's interesting you do mention the demand side. I've been involved in a project called Rewired Earth, which is very much looking at how do we kind of get the really strong policy signals and demand signals out into the market, because fundamentally, again, back to, our markets are hardwired for a certain metric, which is based on kind of your best product at the lowest price, and without those metrics in there. And so how do we, again, within reporting, get that communicated to the wider public, and how do we, obviously get those movers? I mean, I think EVs are a very good example of a very, very clear policy that was put in that was a bit of a shock for everyone at first, and we're well, can't do it. But once everybody got over it, it's, everything is mobilized in that direction, and you're absolutely right that policy in particular is one that everybody seems to mention as if we can just keep on doing that across the sectors, we can probably start to make some movement. So again, same question, Dr. Seeger.
Thank you. I think one of the most important things that we can do right now is change our default settings. We are still talking about transition as an optional, expensive thing that we have to do. It's if we get to 1.5. We'll hit 1.5. That's not a problem, right? We will sail right past it. 1.5 degrees in the UK, so I live in Cambridge, 1.5 degrees means half a meter sea rise. Half a meter sea rise means my home in Cambridge is a seaside destination. I don't have to move. The sea will come to me. Ely is an island. We do not have a choice about the transition. A sustainable, policy-supported transition in a stable environment should be our default setting. What does that mean? That means transition plans that with short-term 5 years, 7 years, 10 years, where we know exactly how we're going to do that. What does that mean for finance? The pension fund industry. The default setting for pensions should be investment in a sustainable pension because it is a long enough timeline, right? There's no point in investing in a sustainable pension right now. So let's switch that default setting. Mortgages, the default setting should be a green mortgage. We should be working on building resilient homes for all of the people to live in. When we look about things like policies, we've just gone through an energy crisis, right? Through a cost of living crisis. What we could have done actually with a lot of that money is improve the fabric of buildings, is looked through the resilience, looked at the insulations, looked at the windows, so that we don't only subsidize the medium and the richer parts of our population. We absolutely have to subsidize the most vulnerable, but we also have to build resilience in the system. So thinking through all of those default settings that we currently have built into our day-to-day lives and switching them into the world that we have to live in, the transition will be beneficial, will be healthier, we will be happier, and we'll be living in a much better world. We just need to start doing it.
Absolutely.
Impossible to top that. I think she said it all there. No, it's really, I was going to say something very similar, which is that the radical can't seem so radical. We really need the radical in every phase. In government, we really do need a holistic and not be so enamored by pure market mechanisms. Pure market mechanisms will fail us. So, you know, we've got to think through that. In our own world, in finance, you know, you're used to credit, I'm used to venture. Energy transition requires a hybrid. It requires all of this to mix together. So how do we mash together these sectors that haven't come together before? And as finance, how do we support these initiatives? So it's going to be a challenge.
Absolutely. I mean, I would say, having worked in that kind of nexus between politics and finance and economics for better part of 10 years now, it is extraordinary the change that we've seen just over the last 3 years in terms of how discussions are. And as you say, you know, everybody in the, dare I say it, you know, once upon a time it was for ESG, the CSR mechanism, and, you know, you might have had some people in woolly jumpers sitting in a, you know, a small office in the basement, and they've really become kind of brought in, teams expanded, not enough people to even fill the roles, as we know within this. So anybody, you know, good career path to go down. But the discussion points around the purpose of finance and the purpose of industry, just to kind of from pre-COP26 to now, and again, people can be cynical about COPs or not, but I would say the one thing we really did well at COP26 was to shift the narrative and shift the focus in terms of how finance and bigger businesses really work their way through this thing. And so for me, it's been an extraordinary to watch that transition and to watch these, what are massive institutions, start to think differently about things and kind of, you know, find that common purpose. So, I mean, I would like to thank everybody today for their time. It's been absolutely a pleasure. And hopefully next year, when we come back, we'll be talking about 2 trillion being mobilized, or doubling or tripling it. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.